to our latest Next Practices weekly session on this Thursday from I4CP, the Institute for Corporate Productivity. Great to see so many returning names and faces to our weekly get-togethers here, as well as some newer names that maybe are attending, joining us for the first time. Please open up your chat and keep it open throughout the call. Would love to have you introduce yourself for now over there in the chat. Let us know where you're dialing in from, what organization you're with, whatever you'd like to share. I've seen in the last couple minutes as we were waiting to get started, folks joining from all over the United States, Minnesota, San Francisco, Cincinnati, Kentucky, Houston, California, Colorado, New York. I saw everything. And I think I saw someone from quite a long distance, someone joining maybe from the Philippines, if that's accurate, maybe a couple people even from the Philippines I'm seeing. So thank you for being with us. We've always got an international audience with us on these Next Practice weekly calls. If you are new to I4CP, know that we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a human capital research firm. We discover the people practices that truly drive high performance. We do that through our research studies, as well as providing in-depth peer connections to our member organizations. With our research, we look at what high-performing organizations do more than low performers, and we define high performance through 4 areas: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. And we like to tease out those HR practices that the top quartile of companies are doing far more often than the lower quartile of organizations, and then draw those out in our reports and other assets. We are a member-based organization, as I alluded to earlier. You see here just a small sampling of our member companies. They really span national, international, global firms, big and small. We've got some of the largest companies in the world, like Amazon, Accenture, and others, as well as smaller companies, some unicorns in the mix. You see they span across all industry verticals as well. Want to extend a special welcome to any of our members that are on the call today. Glad you could join us. If you're not with a member organization but would like to learn more, just reach out to myself or really anyone at I4CP and get a hold of any I4CP employees at email address, and we can get you in touch with the right person. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst at I4CP, and I pretty regularly co-host these Next Practice weekly calls. And this week I've got the honor of co-hosting with Mark Englizian. Good to see you today, Mark. He gave us a wave there. He'll be leading the conversation with our special guest in just a moment. But for now, I have a few other announcements. First off, again, this is a weekly call. Next Practices Weekly. You see the upcoming calls on the 16th and 23rd, where we'll have some guests from Ecolab and Getty Images. We'll take a week off, which I'll explain why in just a moment, and then we'll reconvene on April 6th. Couple of other quick things to note. We recently did a major study on culture fitness. This was following on our study from 2019 on culture renovation. We've got a lot of great findings from this one. You can go to the URL that's there on the screen and that Zeta has put in the chat. Thank you as always, Zeta, and download more information about this one. And if you missed the call, I believe it was February 16th, just go up to the website, because we do record these calls. There's a full archive going back a couple of years now, and you can listen to the recordings and see the notes from any of the sessions. And this one in particular was pretty robust. We had our CEO, Kevin Oakes, my colleague on the research team, Catherine Brecken, and they walked through some of the key findings. So even if you're not an I4CP member, you can get quite a bit of information out of this culture fitness study from that archived recording. The reason that we will not be having a session at the end of the month is we have our Next Practices Now conference going from March 27th through the 30th. It's held each year in Scottsdale, Arizona. We had to switch to virtual, of course, for a couple of years during the pandemic. And so now there is both an in-person and a virtual component. But the in-person experience is obviously where you want to be. You can see all the presentations, and the networking that's provided to HR leaders that attend this event is really powerful. We don't have any trade show. There's no expo. There's no vendors or consultants. So it's really meant for high-level HR leaders to get together, share best and next practices, and learn from each other. To learn more, just go to i4cp.com/conference. And once again, that URL is clickable and over there in the chat. And one of the things we'll be doing, this is brand new news just this week at the conference, as we always do, is announcing the Next Practice Award winners. You see here who the finalists are, and much suspense goes into this. We get many more nominations than this each year. We have a team internally that goes through all of those proposals and chooses the finalists. You see here, first, congratulations to even being a finalist, and then we will announce the actual winners at the conference. So looking forward to that news as well. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to my partner today, Mark, and he's going to introduce our special guest.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and good morning, everyone. I just got a good morning from someone who was on the team at Microsoft over 20 years ago, and haven't seen Kelly in so long, so it was great. It's great to see you. So just really happy to be co-hosting with Tom this morning. And there's so much in the area of total rewards that we could be looking at today, but we think we're going to be scratching at something that maybe we don't talk about too much, and that's how vertical functions inside HR can actually be partnering together on the talent agenda. And I couldn't be more pleased to introduce to you Margeaux King, who is our special guest this morning. Margeaux and I first got acquainted when she was at Ecolab, and she actually held a number of HR leadership roles there. Margeaux was actually a member on our Total Rewards board. And then we sort of got to walk together through a CHRO readiness program that I4CP offers, and Margeaux participated in it. And she's now been the CHRO at the Toro Company for, I think, 7 to 8 months. Is that right?
Yeah, 7 months.
7 months, yeah, 7-month anniversary. So Margeaux and I have very similar background, which is reasons we connect, but she's just full of energy, and we really do appreciate you spending an hour with us this morning, Margeaux. And I think you're joining us from your home in Minneapolis, is that right?
No, I'm in the Toro offices in Bloomington, Minnesota today. So I'm in my work office today. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much again, and really pleased that you're going to share this hour with us. So what we're talking about today, as you and I prep for this, is really this notion that there can be partnerships across the talent function in the HR world to really drive competitive advantage. And so that's kind of the theme of this conversation. I know that a significant portion of your experience, I think you were 15 years at Ecolab, your leadership was really shaped by that experience. So we're going to draw on some of those, but we also want to on your experience at Toro as well. Slide, Tom. Yeah, go. Thank you. So you shared with me the story of how you were leading the total reward function, and there's a point in time when HR policy and compliance to needed a home, sort of came into your world. So tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah. So as we say, and you just use the words, give them a home. I wish I could tell you that sort of the impetus of this was a strategic idea or consideration of saying, wouldn't it be cool to combine these couple of groups together? But it really was as simple as our CHRO saying, we've got this team, they're small but mighty. They sort of have been moved around different parts of the function and they need a home. Can you give them a home? And so I said, sure, I'd love to give them a home. And so, as you think about the reaction of that in the organization, I'll sort of never forget the questions that surfaced. I would say generally people were like, I don't really get it. Like, how do total rewards and HR and policy go together? And, the truth is, because it wasn't really a strategic consideration or decision, I'm not sure any of us really knew going into it what the value would be. And so I would say that it truly was a process and journey of discovery, and so, but one of the catalysts, I think, that sort of planted the seed that then took on many different shapes and forms across, the Ecolab HR function with time over years is that, it gave sort of the lens to look through and to ask the question, how do these two groups make sense together? Or what is the promise of this combination that we can unlock? And so I think we had a couple of early wins, but it started with asking the teams that question, like how can we look at the sort of collection of these couple of COEs through this combined lens? And so, I can share a couple of quick examples of early wins and sort of that really drove increased momentum. But I think a great example is at Ecolab, we really had a true ambition of progressing our work and our journey in the pay equity space. And so when you think about, traditional compensation team, and there's a really good one at Ecolab, very talented, who has, put in place incredible governance and process and strategic frameworks to really manage compensation globally at the organization. But there wasn't sort of the somebody else looking at it from time to time and saying, if we really analyze the outcomes of that governance structure and the decisions that managers make, leveraging the governance structure, are we seeing the outcomes that we intend for that governance to produce? And so one of the first ideas we had was to say, it could be kind of cool for the HR policy and compliance team to take the lead in running a pay equity study, find an external partner. So instead of having the team that sets the governance, runs the processes, looks at the data all the time, be the one to really analyze it and say, are we creating equitable outcomes in the way that we hope to, give it to somebody else and let them sort of take the leadership role, look at it through the new lens, find a partner that is somebody that doesn't already work, with us from a vendor perspective in the compensation space. And so that, over a couple of different audits over a few different years was a pretty phenomenal milestone for Ecolab in, the DEI work, but also specifically from a pay equity perspective. And so that's one example. I think a few others, if you think about immigration, which really sat in HR policy and compliance, so the nuts and bolts of managing immigration for a global workforce, and then mobility, which, global mobility, think about expatriate assignments and those kinds of things sat in compensation. And so at first, we just put those two teams together to talk about, how does it work together? How do we streamline the employee experience for somebody sort of going through a global move or making, doing a local transfer? And so at first it was just about combining their perspectives and having them walk around each other's processes. And with time, I think, we made the decision to say, really the global mobility team should take accountability for immigration and build that out as more of a true COE as it relates to mobility. And so, you've got both in that first combination of these two teams, you've got both just the benefit of bringing their brains and perspectives together and looking at things differently or almost challenging each other's processes and work in different ways. But it also led to other structural decisions about, like, maybe we should rethink the way these teams are organized and combine some of them to truly, strengthen the employee experience.
So let's talk about the people that had reservations. Where did the reservations come from? Was it the policy and compliance team? Was it from the reward team? Was it from other people who were looking from the outside and sort of had that big question mark?
Yeah, I think in this particular example, where, combining these two teams, it was probably less reservation and more just it doesn't make sense to me. Like, why are we doing that? So probably more that we needed to find some proof points that this could add value, in a way that otherwise we might not have unlocked. Had we not brought it under sort of one common umbrella and pulled those teams together in a more intentional way. So for this particular combo, and I know, we'll kind of talk about a few others, but for this particular combo, I would say it was less about reservation, but it was the first time we had done something like this in the function where you sort of bring two groups that you don't normally in a classical HR structure see together. And so we just had to sort of figure out how it made sense, because even to me, when she said, "Can you give him a home?" I said, "Sure." How will these two teams sort of work together? And so for me, even, it was really a process of discovery.
Yeah, very good. So we leave this example. Did there end up being some developmental benefits for the people on the team?
Yeah. One of the things, and I try to bring this perspective, and I would say that probably really crystallized through this particular experience of leading the combination of these two teams. It's really changed the way I think about leveraging HR talent. And so I think historically, I might have seen the world a little bit more defined by their role. So this is what they do, and these are the confines of the role. And so here's, who will give this project to, or here's who will take the lead on that. And this really changed that perspective that I take into how I think about aligning work across the HR function now. And so if I take the employee relations and compliance pillar as an example in this combination, historically that could have been a very, defined role. So they manage policy, they make sure that the policies are compliant and updated from a state and, federal regulatory landscape. But what it allowed us to do, because we sort of combined the resources, right? So we probably could have gotten there a different way, but it sort of provided the platform for that. It was like when we had a project. And so I think, COVID was a great example of where this started to come together, right? I mean, everybody was like, wow, roll up your sleeves, all hands on deck. But there were other places too, paid parental leave, which you could say at a very specific place is a policy. But instead of having this particular leader who led HR and compliance just lead the development of creating a policy around paid parental leave, we said, why don't you lead sort of the effort around how do we better support working parents that have growing families? And so, work with benefits, work with compensation, work with TA, work with the DE&I team, and think about this opportunity far bigger than just we need a policy. And so for her, I think, and she and I still talk about this regularly. I mean, it was having the opportunity to sort of play a very different, broader role in the organization really contributed, to her development, but also, those that she had a chance to partner and work with.
That's a great example, because not only did she benefit, your organization benefited because it became less about writing a policy and more about looking at an initiative to really support your business. So wonderful example. I'm going to ask you this question, just be prepared on your next example, but I'm also interested in knowing how this has shaped you, knowing that you were, now that we could look back over the last 3 to 5 years, you were getting ready to take the CHRO chair, and how did this sort of impact you? Maybe there's just a small snippet you could share before we move on to another example.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and maybe an important bit of, sort of important factoid in the scenario is that, Mark mentioned I led total rewards at Ecolab, but I was not a total rewards subject matter expert. And so I grew up as an HR business partner and spent, a good portion of my career, both before and, during my 15 years at Ecolab as an HR business partner leading HR for global businesses and functions. And so when I was asked to sort of step over and sit in the total rewards chair, that was a very profoundly developmental experience for me, certainly technically, but also personally, because I had sort of lived my life in this space of, I had an intuitive sense for how to do the work. I just knew how to be an HR business partner. I knew how to design, an organization or a business for growth. It was a space I felt just really comfortable in and prepared to do. And when I stepped into the total rewards chair, I mean, it's technical for those of you who sit in that chair. Like, I mean, you actually really have to know what's happening. It's not stuff you can just sort of navigate your way through, right? And so I think personally, going through that experience that was vulnerable and very humbling and quite daunting, until I sort of got my sea legs and figured it out, has helped me, number one, know that I can, kind of go into new and unfamiliar situations and I know how to navigate my way through that. But it's also helped me as a leader to challenge others and to give others the opportunity to do that in maybe a more creative or aggressive way than I would have in the past. And I think it also just lets me, so coming into that world without the subject matter expert, and working with my team who did have the subject matter expert together, those perspectives got us to very different places. And so I think it just sort of furthered and deepened the power of sort of combining perspectives, looking at things from a totally new angle, honestly giving project and work to the people who aren't the subject matter experts, and then making sure they've got the appropriate supports around, because you get to a very different place.
By the way, I just really love what you said about 5 minutes ago about selecting people to work on projects based on title versus based on their skill set. I think we're learning a whole lot about this over the last 5 years. That people, we don't like to be pigeonholed. We like it that we have an area of expertise, but we like to work on other things too. And so, for you to have discovered with this HR policy leader, her ability to stretch across what could have been an uncrossable border in the past, I think was great. And it's a note I would give to the audience is that, looking, when you're trying to fill out a team for something, a project or a task or a new business or whatever, don't just look at titles. Look at what people are interested in. Look at what people like to do, what they want to do, how they want to stretch their wings. So let's go to a different Ecolab example, Margeaux, and that's when you brought rewards and talent together. Wow, that's a pretty big deal. So tell us that story briefly.
Yeah. And I see that Paul is on and he was a part of this journey. So he can probably chuckle and remember the mix of reactions. And so as organizations do, super fun, he says, good. As organizations do, we continue to evolve, structure and think about things differently. And so as Ecolab continued to think about the HR service delivery model, employee relations and compliance went into sort of a more traditional HR operations service center, which, made sense for where we were in that journey. And then as that team sort of moved to another area, I had the opportunity to take talent as I was still in the total rewards chair. And what I would describe as the mix of reactions, I think similar to the first example, you had some who went, well, that's sort of an odd combo. Why are we putting those two teams together? What's the value proposition there? You had some who were really excited, I think in part because they had experienced, that first example in the total rewards team. And so maybe had a different sort of perspective coming in to say, well, I've seen this movie before, I know how it can play out. And then it wasn't sadness, it kind of looks like that, the face, but it was more probably reservation. And as, we kind of dug into where that reservation was coming from, I would say it was probably most centered around a concern that would somehow, combining those two very important, functions within the HR space together under one leader would somehow mean that one or the other was going to be diminished or deprioritized, or maybe not get the same kind of leadership attention and focus. And so I'd say the reservations really came more from that. I think, when we think about what it, and I had the chance to only scratch the surface, in this combo before I left, but, similarly to what I talked about in the first example, I knew, because I had been through, this experience of thinking about bringing teams together that you might not traditionally see in a structure. I knew there was huge value opportunity there, but I needed to sort of tell the story of how I saw it, especially because there were some reservations and concerns about, a potential deprioritization of one or the other. And as I said to this team, as we brought them together, when you think about, total rewards, so benefits, the way we care for our people and their families and take care of their needs and help them prepare for the future and all the things that sit in that space, and compensation, the way that we reward them and recognize them and incent them to do the things and outcomes we seek to create as a company. And then you couple it with talent management, so leadership, succession, development, learning, talent acquisition, how we go out and seek, how we say hello to people, that very first impression. When you combine all of that together, you really are such a, those two teams are such a huge part of the collective employee experience. And so the opportunity to sort of create more of the forums to come together and to talk about how each of those pieces of the holistic part influence what it feels like to join Ecolab, what it feels like to work at Ecolab, from the time they say hello, or even before they say hello, to the time they say goodbye, whether they retire or go on to something new, and all of this sort of meaningful experiences in the middle, whether it's new jobs, it's growth and development, it's pay, it's the way we take care of, them personally and their whole, sort of health and that of their families. And so kind of putting it out there to say, look at this cool opportunity to just step outside your own sort of defined space and say, how do I sort of change my lens and broaden the perspective to say, together, this team really defines in many ways what it feels like and looks like to work here. And so how can we walk around that opportunity we have together to create, strengthened outcomes? And so we started to identify lots of things. We, dipped our toes in. There was a lot of excitement. And honestly, I remember when I shared the news, the difficult decision that I was going to join the Toro Company, a couple of my team members said, "Oh, this was just so energizing. It was getting so exciting." And I remember saying to them, "Well, you don't need me. And you don't even need the structure, right? Even if it were to change, because now you know how to do this. It's behaviors, it's practices, right? You don't have to sort of report under one leader to find the same kind of energy and value and strength in how you see your own work amidst the collective work." So I think I'm sure that I hope, like Paul could say, right, that work is continuing, but I think just a ton of promise and opportunity that we started to unlock there. And maybe, just a couple of examples. So if you think about talent acquisition, at the time that this combo happened, everybody on this call has lived this collective shared painful experience of what became an incredibly competitive talent market. And so one of the things we talked about was, how do we make sure that our recruiters are more steeped in our total rewards offerings so that they can truly sell, what's compelling and differentiated, and not feel quite so uneasy about how they talk about equity or LTI, or how they talk about, the retirement offerings, or the fact that, Ecolab still has a pension, and how do you explain the value of that? So as one sort of example, just to give a little flavor of where we saw you could do that without putting the teams together, but it sure does create sort of a natural opportunity to learn about how to build that practice in.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the call. This notion of do you need to change the structure, right, in order to unlock some of these opportunities? And I know your perspective is, yeah, you could make a structural change, but that's not required. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Before we leave this example, Margeaux, I'm curious to know how the business leaders responded to you mashing together rewards and talent.
Yeah. So here's my take on this, and there may be people who see this very differently. So maybe it's provocative, maybe it's not. I don't think that employees and business leaders really necessarily care how HR work gets done. I just think they care what it is that gets delivered, right? How they're supported. And so it's funny because sometimes I think we spend a lot of time talking about that or, sharing with them sort of structure changes we're making. And at the end of the day, I don't know that they care a lot, right? What they care about is the way in which you collectively support them, meet their needs. And from an employee perspective, we would talk about that a lot across these two combinations. It's like, the more you see your role, so maybe it's benefits or, pick your spot as being so, precisely defined and thinking, well, an employee goes here for that and they go here for that. Like they don't care. They don't care who it is that owns it, right? They just want their experience to be easy, simple, comprehensive, right? And so there wasn't a lot of sort of resistance from business leaders. I'd say it was probably more within our own function, just trying to sort of get past some of the reservations there. But at the end of the day, I don't think I try not to spend a whole lot of time there because I don't think it's that important to them.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. What I do think that happens is it's important to set an expectation of how our conversations with these leaders could be different going forward, right?
Yeah, that's
I think business leaders get very, very sort of routine in their expectations of what they get from who in HR. And when all of a sudden, you're having a broader conversation about something even more strategically impactful than just, the little slice that this CFO thinks you're responsible for, they kind of get this quizzical look, it's like, so, helping them understand that, we are partnering across our teams in HR to provide more of a strategic conversation for you and a strategic approach. I think your example of looking across the employee experience is a great one. Helping leaders understand that, whether you're in a COE or whether you're a business partner, I think is an important step to take.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tom.
I was just gonna.
Yeah. I just wanted to jump in and I loved your example of connecting TA with that part of talent with total rewards is sort of the overall employee value prop and making it easier for them to convey that to candidates. The other area of talent that I think where I just see this makes a lot of sense, and maybe it's because I'm biased, I come from L&D, but to the extent people in total rewards and maybe the history of a particular company see L&D as compliance training or just something that's required of people, as opposed to the way a lot of L&D professionals see themselves, which is really giving a benefit to employees to develop themselves, and it's this broader notion of learning, and it's not something you're being forced to do aside from the required training. I've seen a lot of companies where the L&D folks are really trying to get the training opportunities, the learning opportunities injected into that total reward sort of package and brochure that collects together all the more traditional benefits and incentives, and make sure that that's really emphasized there. So I'm assuming that doing what you've done here at Ecolab made it easier to make those connections.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. Right. Sort of like we talked about, and I know Mark teed up, we'll go here next, but I think the structure change, right, putting it under a leader, it just created the platform for the discussion, because we sort of had to ask the question, how is this going to be useful to us? And in some ways sort of prove the value to ourselves, so that we could, tell the compelling story. So it made it easier to do things like you described, but I think you make a great point. And Paul is the head of learning at Ecolab, I think, had really reached in to say, as we think about training managers, right, and helping them be really good at their jobs, how do we make sure that they understand things like compensation, really, really understand it in a way that they can talk about it and make sure that employees understand the true value proposition of it all. So I think it's a great point.
So Margeaux, I'm gonna dip into the chat for a couple of quick questions. So one individual is asking, did you employ a change management strategy to prepare the organizations for these changes at Ecolab?
No.
Okay.
That's all right.
Yeah. And then the second question is, were there some organizational cost considerations that also was something of a motivation to bring these teams together? Or was this purely strategic in nature?
Yeah, no, there was no cost consideration in either of the situations. And that may have been to some of the, concern, like, is that what this is about? Is that part of it? And it really wasn't. I think if you take the first example, it was a little bit arbitrary, like, they need a home. So it was not really necessarily a strategic, priority or anything else. And we learned from that. And I think the learning then served up this idea to say, well, it's a great way for us to find that same kind of value and benefit. A great way, to continue to develop and grow HR talent. So, but it was in either of those situations, it was not about cost.
Great, thanks. So,
is it possible for me to chime in? Hi, Margeaux. It is so exciting to see you. Hi, this is Roz from Thrivent, and I did work at Ecolab next to Margeaux. So one thing I just really want to emphasize the importance of collaboration between total rewards and talent. It's actually not about structure. Margeaux is commenting on how the team got pulled together, but even if the teams, report separately, how important it is for talent and total rewards to really lock arms in driving employee experience. So Margeaux specifically mentioned the importance of getting our talent acquisition team to really be masterful at articulating the total value of joining the organization. And I lead talent acquisition right now, and we're living in that world of making sure having our total rewards colleagues really prepare our recruiting team on being able to articulate that. And the other thing that I would also share on this particular slide is as part of talent management, many of you, and we certainly went through a whole process of looking at talent retention plans in this cycle of the Great Resignation, and making sure that we identify key talent, that we need to make sure that we have a retention plan. And that retention plan is not just about, career and next steps and executive sponsorship and so on. We actually worked side by side with our total rewards colleagues to make sure that each retention plan has a rewards component as well as a career and development component. So many ways for us to work regularly together, whether you are structurally aligned or not.
Great, thank you. So let's shift, Margeaux, our conversation to your experience at the Toro Company. And like you said, you've been there 7 months, so I know you don't have all the answers, but I also know you've been very busy. So, what are you doing strategically at Toro that would be sort of on point to this topic of partnering across HR functions?
Yeah. So a couple of things I would say, the story of the Toro Company, which is, part of the reason that I got really excited about the potential to join is that they have grown very rapidly, quite quickly. And so part of the opportunity here, when we think about aligning HR and thinking about both structure, but also, to Roz's good point, the non-structural opportunities to strengthen the way we provide service delivery to the organization is about scaling. So when a company grows so quickly, so fast through a couple of big acquisitions, there's some scaling to do. And what I think is so fun about where we are in that process here is like the ingredients are there. We have Workday, like we've got all the tools and the stuff, great talent on the team. But it's just a matter of sort of what do you make with all of that and how do you realize the value of that? I think also because, you think about the size of the organization, when organizations are smaller, sometimes they do some more of these combinations like the couple we just talked about, because it's the way they sort of need to make it work and the volume's not there. And so when I came in 7 months ago, one of the things I remember asking before I joined, can I get view to the HR org charts? And when I got them, I remember thinking, where's everybody? Where are the HR business partners? And so as I got in and started to dig in, they were really organized a little differently, probably a lot to do with size and this scaling piece that I mentioned, and also to do with, giving people opportunities to grow and lead in different spaces. I think the opportunity cost is that, we really have some work to do to strengthen true strategic HR business partner capability. And so I've been busy, in addition to helping to lead some pretty big enterprise org design and leadership succession plays, also in parallel looking at, as we design the company for the future, for growth, and sort of create the roles and the structure that we'll need. In parallel, how do I think about what the HR, structure and model needs to look like? And so it was fun to be able to launch the enterprise structure about a month ago, and then a week and a half later, be able to launch a very rethought HR model and structure where we've built true HR business partner capability pillars. I think, that the last piece here that is very related to that, and I think sometimes when those like in HR business partners get buried into other areas or under a COE leader, there is from my experience, a very healthy tension that comes into play across functions and talent groups in an organization, because typically you're sort of seeing the world from a different vantage point in a different way. So if you're an HR business partner, where I spent a good portion of my career, and I can say this with nothing but admiration and respect, I've sat in both chairs. I totally understand how we end up sort of seeing the world how we do. From an HR business partner perspective, you are there to help drive the needs, enable the needs, serve the needs of the business. And so you've got business leaders or functional leaders who are pushing for different things. You're trying to sort of navigate that while staying true to philosophy and governance and sort of not let things get too crazy. But sometimes from a COE lens, it can feel like, that's super, maverick, like you're sort of, throwing caution to the wind as we think about, how big of an offer you want to do or how quickly you want to move somebody. And then from a COE lens perspective, you tend to see, not always, so it's not, and I've been in the role, so I give the feedback also to myself. Sometimes you see the world more around efficiency, administrative ease, simplification. How do you create things that scale? And so sometimes that sort of flexibility and agility around holding true to that where you can, while also being creative and flexible and agile to meet the needs of a growing and changing business, sometimes that balance can get a little offset. And so one of the things I was really focused on doing in this new model is just sort of reestablishing that balance. And so making sure that we've got those two perspectives weighing against each other in a very constructive way so that we are doing both. We are looking through the lens of ease and scaling and efficiency, while also saying, how do we need to continue to innovate and remain agile and, be flexible around meeting the needs of a growing company?
So Margeaux, one of our participants today asked the question, what are the causes of siloed functions in HR? And I think you just answered it very articulately. And so it's very true. You have a business-facing HR person and a COE person who's got a very sort of different objective, right? And so I remember going to an organization where I was hearing nothing but people complaining. Comp was complaining about talent acquisition. Learning was complaining about HR business partners. They were just complaining everywhere. And I finally said in a meeting one time, are we going to complain or are we going to collaborate? And they all kind of looked at me and said, well, what do you suggest? I said, let's start having breakfast together every Wednesday morning. So everybody can come, I'm buying, and let's just start getting to know one another. Let's start breaking down some of these barriers. Let's start having unemotional, objective conversations about what we need from other people around the table, and the collaboration began to grow. So, I think that natural tension that you've described is probably present in most organizations, and it's not a bad thing, but we've got to figure out how to make it work for your business.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about structure. We promised that we would, so we probably should. Your Ecolab example was, the two examples were about structure. I remember a time in my career when I was leading rewards and business partners, which again, you don't typically see in an individual. I realized later that was for my own personal career development. The CEO had ideas for me, and really wanted to see that I could work in that environment. But you always don't have the benefit of structural changes. So what is your advice to someone who is saying, I have to work more collaboratively across the aisle, so to speak, with my other HR partners? What would you suggest that people do who really want to engage collaboratively?
Yeah. And I think, building on a question you asked earlier, which is how has this changed me? These are some of the things I would offer, that the ways in which those experiences of bringing two groups together has, led to me seeing opportunity and work through a very different lens. And so I'll offer, what some of those lenses or sort of new behaviors I hold myself accountable to now, having gone through those experiences. So the first, as it shows there, is when you take work, and again to this idea that wherever you're sitting in the function, you tend to sort of see through a different lens. So I have a consistent practice and expectation that when you have new work or you're looking at rolling something out, that you walk it through with someone who's never done it, doesn't have the subject matter expertise. Really to sort of bounce it up and get a very different perspective. I have never done that and not had a richer outcome, so it changes that perspective. But it's different than saying, I'm going to, tap my fellow HR business partner and show them, or I'm going to tap my, fellow Total Rewards leader and show them, but really putting it in front of and walking it through with someone who's never done it and who doesn't have the knowledge. The second one, and this is sort of an interesting one, and what I would offer is sort of talk yourself out of it instead of talking yourself into it. So when you look at starting something new, or you've got a project, or you need to, tackle a new deliverable, start with a diverse subject matter expert team. Just start there. Instead of, we tend to, I think, very often say, who else should I involve? Is there another stakeholder perspective I should get? And so what I've started to do is instead begin with that. And then if I need to talk myself out of it for some reason, I can. But starting with that mindset would be a second sort of piece I'd offer. This one's really important. And I think it has really become quite visible to me that we often have a tendency to do this. So imagine, you're sort of sitting with a team and you say, look, we've got a new deliverable or project we've got to tackle. This team might not have capacity to do it. Who out there, will this be a great development assignment for? They don't have to have the knowledge, because we'll make sure we, surround them with the right kind of support. I so often would hear leaders or my peers say, well, they don't have the capacity. They're too busy, right? I don't think that would be something they're interested in. And so I've made it a practice for myself and encourage, my team to do the same, which is to say, don't decide for them, ask them. One of the things I've learned is that high potential, talented people find a way. And if they want to do it and they want the development experience and they want to extend their impact outside of their core space, they will figure it out. It's not something we have to figure out for them. No projects are off limits. What I mean by that is, you might be tempted, it's somewhat similar to, the second block, but you might be tempted to say, well, no, this is about building a new job structure, so it's got to be compensation, right? I would say no projects are off limits to look at who could lead this that maybe doesn't sit in the area of subject matter expertise, that we can surround them with the right people. It'd be a great development assignment for them. They get the experience and exposure without having to actually sit in the chair. And honestly, they'll see the opportunity very differently. And then, finally, you, and I know many of us do this, right? You can facilitate this kind of development and broadening of perspectives through more formal rotations, but that can be tricky sometimes. I think projects are a fantastic way to do it. And so when we have new work, we throw it in the middle of the table. No questions, like every project, it goes in the middle of the table. Sometimes it goes back to the area of subject matter expertise, but at least we've walked around the decision intentionally.
So I love these tips, and I really appreciate you walking through them. I'm reflecting on my own career and remembering where my favorite poaching places were, and you know what I mean by that. And I don't mean poaching in a negative sense, but where did you typically find people that weren't top of mind or weren't your first instinct, right? And I loved pulling people out of finance. I mean, it was just, because their minds are just so sharp and they think differently, and and then I loved pulling people off the floor, off of the the manufacturing floor or the distribution center floor or the retail store employee. Again, just thinking out of the box a little bit about who can we bring in to add some additional perspective to what we're working on, not to change their job, not to change their title, not to change their pay, but to get their perspective and to give them an opportunity to influence an outcome.
Yeah, I think it's a great ad, thinking outside the function itself.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about competitive advantage. In fact, one of our participants is asking the question about, since culture has become such a competitive advantage to attract and retain talent, is there a possibility of having a culture competency inside employee experience or inside Total Rewards? What are your thoughts about that?
It's very top of mind for me here at the Toro Company, culture itself, because the organization has gone through such growth via acquisition. And you sort of think about, if I walk the halls here and say, what do you love about working here? Why do you stay? Well, it's the culture. For those people, it's the culture of Toro, which is now a division of the Toro Company. And so it's very front of mind for me. I think we all own that. I think, I ultimately, and I appreciate this very much about my leader, the CEO here, he believes, ultimately he owns that. And so I think there's so much, and it's such an interesting topic to explore, because it's like the word strategy or anything else. You can ask a room of 10 people to define it and you get a different answer. I think what's important to me may be less around structuring kind of a COE, but that every single one of our, pillars in the HR space at a minimum, are seeing culture as a core responsibility of theirs. How does the work that they're doing impact the culture and what it feels like to work here? So I think it's something we collectively own. I don't think we talk about it as intentionally as we need to, because every decision you make to start a new recognition program, to stop one, to change your incentive plan, to start a new one, every single one of those has a cultural implication. And I think sometimes we don't bring that kind of intentionality into the dialogue. And so it could just be something as simple as building that intentionality.
Yeah, go ahead, Margeaux, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna maybe offer a few things, because I know you mentioned around, so this is interesting, it's developmental, there's all those things, but does it really sort of create a competitive advantage? And so I just wanted to offer sort of a few pieces. We talked about the first one, right? So, and it doesn't have to be structure, right? We've already covered that, whether it's practices and the way you sort of approach work differently, or bringing teams together, which again, you can do with or without structure. I think we have the ability to really impact the employee experience as a collective whole. and see our work as a part of something much larger, that otherwise we tend to get a little bit more siloed. And so I mentioned the example about, let's not just look at paid parental leave. Let's look at how do we support, growing families. And that just brings a very different perspective. The second one really is kind of interesting. So tackle problems or opportunities with less focus. And it gets a little bit to, and I think, Roz mentioned this in her example, and I had a very similar experience during this crazy talent market during my time at Ecolab, when we combined total rewards and talent, and we were trying to do retention plans and trying to be proactive in a world that was very reactive. But, to building on Roz's remarks, we put those two teams together, the VP of Comp, who is an extraordinary leader, the head of talent, another extraordinary leader, and said, instead of doing like the typical retention assessment plan that talent might lead us through, what would you add? How do we need to be thinking about this? And the outcome of those two pairing up, they sat in leader meetings together. They sat with HR leaders and sort of walked it through. And they just brought such a richer perspective to the table because they had a combined sort of leveraged each other's points of view. The tension we talked a lot about. So I think, that serves up in a lot of ways when you think about competitive advantage. For one, that tension helps you shape an agenda and set of priorities that's truly going to make a difference because it balances those two perspectives. And so you might say, the comp, team sat in an office and created a beautiful masterpiece of a new incentive plan. And then you go out and you look at what our people are doing and you go, well, that's not what they need, right? That's not going to drive sort of the outcome we want. And so that tension, I think, can really help you shape priorities differently. Moving faster and more effectively. And so, the comp leader, when we combine those two teams, I remember sometimes would get a little frustrated and say, I'm getting flooded with offers. We're trying to pay bonuses. Like, I'm just going to hang a sign that says we're closed. And I was like, oh, we can't really close. So what can we learn? Like, how does this work better? And for her, she said, I need context. And so if I could sit her with the head of talent to say, what are the succession plans? We need an offer for this person to move to this job, but what is that person's job after that? And then the one after that. And it just allowed our comp team to think about what they were doing in such a more holistically and strategic way versus I need this offer for this person tomorrow. And then we talked a lot about this as well. I mean, I think it's clear, when you look for these opportunities, you're developing talent who will have broader and more balanced perspectives, and they don't have to sit in the chair. Give them a project, right? Put them alongside somebody else. So there's a lot of ways to do that. And I think that can really create a competitive advantage from an HR talent perspective.
Well, that's rich stuff. You put five really great suggestions there, and we really do appreciate it, Margeaux. Believe it or not, our time is up. You can tell this was good when it flew. Thank you so much for not only sharing your perspectives, but examples of your time at Ecolab and Toro. We really do appreciate you being part of our I4CP family. And it's just been wonderful to have you participate with this group today. And I'm hoping that we'll see you down here in Scottsdale in a couple of weeks, huh?
Yeah. Thanks.
I'll turn it back to you, Tom.
Yeah, I just want to extend my thanks as well, Margeaux. Great information, great sharing from across two different companies you've been with. So appreciate all that perspective. Thank you, Mark, for facilitating the conversation. And just one final reminder to everyone that the conference Mark was just alluding to is our Next Practices Now event at the end of this month in Scottsdale, Arizona. So if you haven't registered, there is still time to do so. We'd love to see as many of you there as possible. Otherwise, look forward to seeing folks again next Thursday when we'll have another great guest and another great conversation. So until then, thanks everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.